So I want to say a massive thank you to David for sharing with our young people this morning. We deeply appreciate what you've shared with us, David, so thank you so much. We're going to have a reading, and Audrey Graham is going to bring that reading from Ecclesiastes chapter 4.
Today's reading is from Ecclesiastes chapter 4. Then I looked again at all the injustice that goes on in this world. The oppressed were weeping, and no one would help them. No one would help them because their oppressors had power on their side. I envy those who are dead and gone. They are better off than those who are still alive. But better off than either are those who have never been born, who have never seen the injustice that goes on in this world. I've also learned why people work so hard in this world to succeed. It is because they envy their neighbours. But it is useless. It is like chasing the wind. They say a man would be a fool to fold his hands and starve to death. Perhaps so, but it is better to have only a little peace with peace of mind than to be busy all the time with both hands trying to catch the wind. I have noticed sometimes something else in life that is useless. Here is a man who lives alone. He has no son, no brother, yet he is always working, never satisfied with the wealth that he has. For whom is he working, and denying himself any pleasure? This is useless too, and a miserable way to live. Two are better than one, because together they can work more effectively. If one of them falls down, the other can help him up. But if someone is alone and falls, it is just too bad, because there's no one to help him. If it is cold, two can sleep together and stay warm. But how can you keep warm by yourself? Two men can resist an attack that would defeat one man alone. A rope made of 3 cords is better, but hard to break. A man may rise from poverty to become king of his country, or go from prison to the throne. But if in his old age he is too foolish to take advice, he is not as well off as a young man who is poor but intelligent. I thought about all the people who live in this world, and I realized that somewhere among them there is a young man who will take the king's place. There may be no limit to the number of people a king rules, yet when he is gone, no one will be grateful for what he has done. It is useless. It is just like chasing the wind. This is the word of the Lord.
So this morning we're looking at Ecclesiastes chapter 4. The Beatles sang about it. 1 in every 4 people suffer from it. The Samaritans receive 11.5 million calls each year, largely because of it. And people of all ages struggle with it. People in their teens, people in their 20s, people in their 60s, 70s and 80s even struggle with it. The problem? Loneliness. Do you remember the Beatles song? Eleanor Rigby? Wasn't that the song? All the lonely people, where did they all come from? John Stott quotes this insightful look at society in the West, and he says this to us: people today are hungry for love, for understanding love, which is the only answer to loneliness, which is the greatest poverty. People are suffering from terrible loneliness, terrible despair, terrible hatred, feeling sometimes unwanted, feeling helpless, feeling hopeless. They've forgotten how to smile. They've forgotten the beauty of a human touch. They are forgetting what is human love. They need someone who will understand them and respect them. And the second person that John Stott quotes is the atheist Bertrand Russell. And he says, 3 passions, simply but overwhelmingly strong, have governed my life: the longing for love and the search for knowledge, compassion for the suffering of mankind. And then he says this, I sought love because it relieves loneliness, that terrible loneliness in which one's shivering consciousness looks over the rim of the world into the cold, unfathomless, lifeless abyss. What's he saying? He's saying there's such terrible loneliness in our society today. And I think that is true. Because our Western society, our materialistic Western society, keeps us warm and comfortable, but they can't keep away that gnawing, painful reality of life. And behind our comfortable curtains and our pleasant facades, inside so many folks, they're struggling with real loneliness. So let's look at this chapter together, chapter 4, and let's unpack it and see what it says. The first thing is this, that life is lonely when you feel that no one cares about you and the troubles that you're going through in verses 1 to 3. You know, folks, people around us are in pain. Verse 1, and I looked and saw all the oppression that was taking place under the sun. I saw the tears of the oppressed, and they have no comforter. No one really cares. Power was on the side of the oppressor, and they have no comforter. No one really cares. Do you know, every day we pass people in pain, but we can be so busy that we don't have time to stop and notice and really see it. But Solomon does see. Solomon does notice in verse 1, I looked and I saw, I noticed all the oppression that was taking place. Folks, what does it mean to be oppressed? Well, I came across this description. To be oppressed is to be pulled down, to be beaten down, to feel broken and crushed, either by people or powers or systems or circumstances that make your life a misery. Is that not what it is to be oppressed? Think of the poorest people in poor parts of our world, working so hard, so often working really, really hard, and yet they are trapped, they are oppressed in poverty, not made by themselves, but made by the more powerful. Or think of people who are crushed and broken either by personal tragedy or family troubles that have shaken and devastated their lives. And twice it says here, they have no comforter. In other words, no one seems to care. Twice he says that. And he says in verse 2, well, when I looked at the situation, when I looked at the pain these people are in, some would be better off dead. He says, and I declared to the dead who had already died are happier than the living who are still alive, but better than both is a person who has never yet been born. Do you know, life is so tough for some people that they actually say that. I wish I'd never been born. Isn't that awful when you get to that stage? When you're going through such pain that in your heart you're saying, Lord, I really do wish I'd never been born. Life is so hard. So the challenge question that I put for you and for me, every day we pass people in pain. Do you need to ask God, open our eyes so that we can begin to notice their pain? Or do we need to open our hearts and our hands so that we can do something practically to care for and comfort people in pain? And here's the question, who are you caring for and comforting at this moment? Who are you and I noticing? Number 2, life is lonely when you get all caught up in the rat race of life. I never understand, folks, why they call it a rat race. And if you do, please come and have a wee word with me and tell me. 2 small rats running along, racing each other. Why do they call it a rat race? Look at what he notices in verse 4. And I saw and I noticed this man's perception, this man's thinking. I saw and I noticed that all labour and all achievements bring from man's envy of his neighbour. Verse 4 in the Good News Bible puts it like this. I have also learned why people work so hard to succeed. It is because they envy their neighbour. Do you know, we do live in a consumer-driven society. A society that's driven by manufacturers' needs to sell us more, to reach higher targets, to beat the competitors, to increase their productivity and turnover. And you've got to admit that there's this competitive streak inside of us as individuals that drives us to succeed, to achieve, and maybe not even to keep up with the Joneses, but even to overtake the Joneses. In the Reader's Digest, I read this: nothing devalues your car as much as when your neighbour gets a new one. I think that's super, isn't it? And Solomon says, I saw all labour and all achievement spring from man's envy of his neighbour. This too is meaningless, pointless, a chasing after the wind, a chasing after your tail. Because no matter how much you chase after it, you'll never have enough of it. And then he gives us this in verses 5 and 6. And he gives us these options. Number one, you can drop out. He says the fool folds his hands and ruins himself. The foolish person just simply drops out of the rat race, folds his hands and says, I'm doing nothing. And that's a foolish option. Number two, the second option in verse 6, better one handful with tranquility than two handfuls with toil. In other words, the picture here is of a man who is so busy working with both hands, he hasn't got time to stop. I think the Good News Bible unpacks it well. They say that a man would be a fool to fold his hands and let himself starve to death. Perhaps so, but it is better to have only a little with peace of mind than to be busy all the time with both hands trying to catch the wind, because you're never going to be satisfied. And what's the balance? Well, on the one hand, there's the fool who does nothing. On the other hand, there's this guy, this workaholic, who's working day and night and trying to make more money, trying to get more of this and more of that. Well, what's the answer? Well, the answer is in the middle. Better one handful with tranquility. Better less with peace of mind. There's a balanced lifestyle. You know, on one hand you work, and with the other hand, you create space in your life for those things that will nourish and refresh your heart and your mind and your soul. Rob Parsons says this: no one ever said on their deathbed, I wish I spent more time at work, in the office, the yard, the study. And that's why I think that Sunday is such a special day. God has given us this beautiful day, designed this day to free us from the responsibilities of work, to set us free from this rat race. And what are we doing? I think Sunday is God's design to release you from the madness of the intensely busy lives by giving us one day a week, not only to worship Him in an extended way, which is really key, but also to recharge our batteries emotionally, physically, spiritually, and to renew our families just by having extended time just to stay and to play and enjoy. And here we are in society just throwing it to the wind, tramping over it. So the challenge question, what are you working so hard for? What's the busyness of your life really accomplishing? What is God's purpose for your life? Are you trying to accomplish His purpose or your own goals? And question two, are you using Sunday in a positive way to refresh, recharge, renew your life and your family, spiritually, emotionally, physically? Are you finding that you're doing that? Number three, life is lonely when you have no really close friends who will stick with you through some of the most difficult and demanding days of your life, verses 7 through to 12. Look at the picture in verse 7 and verse 8. Again, the Good News Bible puts it like this: here is a man who lives alone. He has no son, no brother, yet he is always working, never satisfied with his wealth he has. For whom is he working so hard? I mean, that's the picture, isn't it? This guy has got no family, and yet he's working day and night, and yet he's a lonely man living a life of pointless busyness, working day and night, and no matter how much he works, he's never content, he's never satisfied, he's never got enough. Look at some lives, intensely busy, working all hours, and you think, well, what are you working for? What are you doing it all for? Who are you doing it all for? Work and wealth are no substitute for love and real close friends and friendship. But so often we're too busy. I'm too busy. I just look at my own life, too busy to build and invest in such friendships. Here's a wee quote from an Archbishop of Canterbury who was a bachelor. And here's a quote about his life. He says, in the loneliness of his bachelor life, his great need was not for friends of whom he had plenty, any more than work of which he had too much. It was for that old, simple and human thing, someone in daily nearness to him. Just a really close friend, just someone that he could really just spend time with and enjoy. And you know, folks, that is why our church family vision is to try and create a family built on relationships. It is not about going to meetings. It is not about turning up for things. It is about how do we create meaningful friendships, close, supportive, caring Christian friendships. I love Rick Warren's quote from his book, and I think it's so true, and I hope it's true for here. And he says this: a friend told me of a survey that he took in church. When he asked, "Why did you join this church?" 93% of the members said, "I joined because of the minister." He then asked, "Well, what if your minister leaves? Will you leave?" 93% said no. When he asked them why they wouldn't leave, their response was this: "Because I have made friends here." Because I have made friends here. And you've got to make friends. If you want friends in this church family, where your church family is, you make the friends, you take the initiative, you do it, don't leave it to somebody else. Notice the shift in analogies from minister to other members. That is both normal and healthy. And folks, that is the way it should be. I wouldn't want you here because of me. I'd want you here because you have invested some hard work in making real friends in this church family. So the challenge question: are you putting your work before building close friendships in your life? Who are you close friend to? And are you coming alongside someone in their time of trouble and distress? Are you making yourself available? Proverbs 18 verse 24 says, "A man of many companions may come to ruin, but there's a friend who sticks closer than a brother." Well, of course, we use that often to point to Jesus, but folks, it could point to you. Wouldn't it be lovely if someone said of you from St. Paul's, "You know, I have many loose friends, but there's one person in this church family who is such a good friend, sticks closer to me than family, has helped me through many a difficult time." Wouldn't that be lovely if someone said that of you here from St. Paul's? And lastly, number 4, life is lonely when you've worked hard to get to the top of your profession and then you are replaced by someone younger just to please the crowd, in verses 13 to 16. So the picture in verses 13 to 16 is of an old king who doesn't heed the warning signs and he gets replaced by a younger, fresher man. Well, you know what happens in football, doesn't it? You can be so popular one season and away the next. But you know, folks, there's a loneliness. There's a loneliness of being a leader. There's a loneliness in that job of leadership. Here's also a quote from Lyndon Johnson, who was the ex-president of the United States. Lyndon Johnson said that the loneliest moment that anyone could experience was when the phone rang in the middle of the night and woke you from your sleep, and a voice said, "Mr. President, I have a call for you." And then there was that split second before you were connected. That split second felt like an eternity. He says, what had happened? Why were you being wakened in the middle of the night? Had a nuclear accident taken place? Had some mistake occurred and war had begun? What major tragedy was about to be reported to you? And then the full weight and the full loneliness of office fell upon a mortal human being's shoulders, and it hurt. I thought that was a great description of a leader, isn't it? And the problem, of course, in verse 16 is that there was no end to the people who were there before, but those who came later were not pleased with their successor. In other words, they replaced one guy with another guy, and the people who came along said, "We don't like him either." It's the fickleness of the crowd, isn't it? You know, you can be popular one day as a leader and you can be thrown on the dust heap the next. Well, you just think of Jesus on Palm Sunday. The crowds were shouting for him. They were applauding him, just delighting in him. And yet 5 days later, Good Friday, that same crowd were calling for his execution. People are so fickle, aren't they? Do you know, folks, there are many men and women in top-level jobs in today's leadership who would gladly get out tomorrow if they could do it. And so he says rightly, This too is meaningless, so pointless. You know, it's the refrain again and again in this chapter. It's just so pointless. And maybe you read this chapter and again you say to me, Arthur, this sounds pretty depressing stuff as he looks at life. But you've got to say it's true to life. It's so real to life and it's so realistic about our lives today. It was written for you. It was written for me. For you and me when we feel isolated or lonely or just very alone, even though you're surrounded by lots of people and lots of friends. So here's the challenge question. Challenge for us inside our church families. Think of all the Sundays that you've sat in these pews. Think of the years that you've come here to St. Paul's. And the question is, how much do we really know each other and know of each other? How much do we really care for and are cared for at deeper levels? Folks, I want to say this to you. And I want us to celebrate what I'm saying. I think we are a genuinely warm and friendly and loving church. And that's something to be celebrated. But the challenge question, is there someone that you can invite this week into your garden for a coffee or a tea? Or something that would build a deeper friendship with someone? Or is there someone you could ring and say, I missed you over these last couple of months of lockdown. Are you okay? What could you do to build deeper friendships with other people in our church family and outside of our church family? I'm not saying what can other people do for you. I'm saying what can you do for other people? Do you know something, folks? When you do it for others, guess what happens? They start to do it back for you. That's the way it works. Don't wait until somebody does it for you. The more you start to do it for others, the more it will come back to you. So let's do it. Let's take the initiative and let's step out. Amen. So it's great to have the CLB take part in our service this week. And here's one of the leaders who's going to share with us what life in lockdown and faith in lockdown has been like for them.
Hi, for those who don't know me, my name is Lynn and I've been involved in St. Paul's CLB for 9 years now, but have been a member of the church family all of my life. Last year, I started a new job as the Children's and Families Worker in Glenavy Parish, but kept my connection to St. Paul's through continuing to volunteer within the CLB. I've been asked to talk a little bit about my lockdown story. Away at the start of this pandemic, even before lockdown began, I became very ill with suspected COVID-19 and even had to be taken to hospital one day as I was struggling to breathe. Thankfully, I was allowed home that very same day to rest and recover. By the time I was well again, lockdown was in full swing. My son's school had closed, CLB had ended, the church buildings had closed, all my children's and youth groups and work had ended. Life looked very different. I was able to continue to work from home for a while, but work looked a little different too. I was taken right out of my comfort zone by having to do Facebook Lives, pre-recorded videos, Zoom meetings, and I never had my phone out of my hand, with many new WhatsApp groups and work social media pages. As every week passed, I kept thinking about all the fun things we should have been doing at home and in work, but they had been taken away from us due to this awful pandemic. Any idea that I had for work, I was told I couldn't do it as it wasn't within the current government guidelines. I can only describe the emotion I felt as grief. Everything that I knew as normal had gone. On top of all of this, I had homeschooling, which started off great, like most people, but after a few weeks, even that became more stressful than it needed to be. I was also worrying constantly about my mum and dad, both out working as essential workers. Things began to really get on top of me and I felt so alone, not able to speak to people about how I was feeling, as it was my job to keep so many others in a place of hope. This became more and more difficult as I started to lose hope myself. One day it all became too much. I had yet another bad day. Struggling to come to terms with lockdown and all the worries, anxiety and stress that came with it. I'd spent most of lockdown praying for others, but that night I prayed for me. I prayed for the hope and strength needed to get through another day. I asked God to show me that He was there and that I wasn't alone. The next morning I headed out to sit in the garden with my morning coffee. It was so peaceful. I couldn't hear any cars There were no children out playing, and I couldn't hear school bells from the local schools around me. All I could hear were the birds. There were so many of them, and they were singing so loudly, so happy and cheerful. In that moment, I remembered a piece of scripture from last year at our CLB Bible class. I went to get my Bible and headed back to the garden, where I read Matthew chapter 6, verses 26 and 27 over and over again. Look at the birds of the air. They do not sow or reap or store away in barns, and yet your heavenly Father feeds them. Are you not much more valuable than they? Can any one of you, by worrying, add a single hour to your life? I felt calm for the first in weeks. Listening to the birds singing while reading about God providing for them helped me to remember that God will provide for me too. I'm not to worry about my life, as it's in God's hands. He was right there with me. My hope was back. We still don't know what is to come in the months ahead, and we will still have bad days, but we can't lose that hope in our Lord, that He is there with us every step of the way. I've used this time to rebuild and grow in my relationship with God, like a personal revival. How have you used your time?